Welcome back to the Physician's Guide to Doctoring. On this week's episode, we have a guest host, so please be the same respectful audience you are for me and enjoy. Hey there, it's Brad. As someone who's passionate about podcasting, I've always thought there should be more support for physicians who want to share their stories and expertise. That's why we're launching Dr. Podcast Network.
We're bringing together a community of physician podcasters with one goal in mind: to provide the tools, connections, and resources you need to grow your show. So whether you've been podcasting for a while or maybe you're just starting, we've designed this network to support you every step of the way, and we're going to help each other rise, not compete.
If this sounds like something you benefit from, we'd love for you to join us as we get closer to launch. So you can sign up at drpodcastnetwork.co for early access. Stay tuned for more details in the coming weeks. Really looking forward to what we can create together. Dr. Podcast Network, where doctors podcast.
Dr. Podcast Network, where doctors podcast.
Dr. Podcast Network, where doctors podcast.
Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle.
Hello, everybody. This is John Schneider, guest host for the Physician's Guide to Doctoring podcast. And I'm extremely grateful to have one of my heroes and idols on the podcast today, Dan Ariely, who is the professor of business at Duke University and author extraordinaire and behavioral scientist. The author of the most recent book is Misbelief. And we are going to have a great conversation on the complexity of medicine, in particular around the aspects of bureaucracy and how we as physicians manage it. So thank you, Professor Ariely, for being here and making the time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's also nice to talk to a group of physicians because as I was in hospital for many years for burns. This is also why I have this funny look of half a beard, because this side is all burns. And it's always a delight to try and help the physician community in some way.
We really appreciate it. And to our listeners, I believe it was Predictably Irrational where I first learned one of your books, where I really remember your story of that experience. And it was eye-opening for me, especially as a physician. And I would encourage all our listeners to go read that. It's often hard for physicians to really appreciate the cognitive aspects of what our patients go through. And your story actually does that in an incredible way. And I know obviously extraordinarily meaningful for you. And I would really encourage our listeners to go read that. So you recently started, and I think it was this year, the Center for
Advanced Bureaucracy.
One of the real challenges that we have in medicine is, it's been said many times over the years, that medicine is so complex that trying to simplify it is almost impossible. And it has to do with the fact that the nested, at least in my mind, the nested systems that you're dealing with, whether it's individual patient care, how that relates to the systems by which you provide that care, then how the systems you provide to pay for that care, the systems, how you regulate that care for safety and onward, creates such a complexity that we've naturally, in a sense, moved into a bureaucratic environment that is oftentimes overwhelming and, for many physicians, for lack of a better word, depressing, because of how it feels now, especially for many physicians, disconnected you can feel from the care as you try to navigate this bureaucracy.
And I think maybe we should start by saying that there's some logic to bureaucracy. Let's have procedures. Let's have things move quickly if they can. For example, if I'm a physician and I see a patient and it's very clear what it is, let's make that decision and flow incredibly easy. And we all understand that under some conditions, creating procedures, automated procedures that take common occurrences and make them the standard is very helpful. Physicians' time is expensive. If we could do something to automate or make part of it more efficient, we have saved everybody. The challenge becomes when we try to apply it to everything and when we make it very hard not to abide by. So, for example, if you have a physician and you say, let's make it really easy for you to prescribe the standard medication, that's great. But if we say like it makes it really hard for you, if you want to prescribe the non-standard medication, you'll have to write the report and you'll have to wait in the office until late in the afternoon, and somebody would call you to make sure you really want that. Now, the system doesn't have a purpose anymore. And that's the part that we're worried about. We're worried about the rigidness of the system where it tries to apply to everything and not just to the most common thing. So that's the first issue. So we say there's, let's say, good procedural efficiency, and then there's bureaucracy, which is to say it's not about that, it's about something else. And then the second thing, and this is the more complex part, is that when there is a productive part of the organization and a bureaucratic part of the organization, now trouble begins. If we are a hospital and we measure ourselves by the health of our patient and how many people we heal and to what degree and their quality of life and all kinds of, we can decide all kinds of measures. That's great. But if some people don't hold themselves accountable to those goals, but they start holding themselves accountable to other goals. For example, I want to know that under my jurisdiction, nobody would use an extra Band-Aid. We know, I don't know hospitals so well, but I'll give an example from my university, like HDU. And my lab, pre-COVID, we did lots of work in other countries, a lot in Africa, and people charged their credit cards, and then they wanted to get reimbursed. And initially, they wanted us to not just give the credit card receipt, but to give also a verification of the exchange rate. So you went ahead and you bought a cup of coffee or you paid for something, and you had the credit card receipt, you had one place, and then you had another place, and the amount. Now, that person is a metaphor that stood there and wanted not just the credit card and not just one additional, but two additional verification of the exchange rate on that day, was not fulfilling the goal of the university. In their mind, the goal was not, let's use our time efficiently and create more research. They basically have a different goal of saying, I don't want anybody to get paid a cent too much or too little because of changes in exchange rate. They stopped being part of the goal of the university and they had their own goal. And I think a lot of organizations are having this split. Universities in general are having this split between academia and administration. I think hospitals probably have this split to even a larger degree between physicians and the administration. And as their administration is getting stronger, they have a very different goal. Right? And now, when you talk to an administrator or bureaucrat and you tell them about the main goal, that you have to understand that's not their main goal. Their main goal is for you to see patients for 12 minutes each and not to spend a minute more with a patient, if that's the rule, right? And if you spend 13 minutes, they think of it as a failure on their parts. The goal is moving from the overall objective, which is fuzzy and not clear, to very clear objective that is on their plate.
That's very fascinating, if you don't mind me teasing that out a little bit, because the battle cry of physicians these days is down with administration, right? This burden of bureaucratic and any number of derogatory terms, bean counters, pencil pushers, tax man, whatever you want to say. Physicians feeling as if their job and primarily their thinking is being burdened by all of this 12-minute restriction. So I wanted to ask you, because in many of the moments where we're asking physicians to enter into discussions around how we do this better, we want to say, for the moment, let's assume good intentions. Let's assume that this administrator has the best intentions for this joint work that we're trying to do, which is take care of the patients and take care of the organization. And I absolutely hear you, because I think that we are diverging in our goals. But if we can assume that the intentions are good, do you see a way that we reconcile that if the goals are diverging as you described?
So first of all, this paper I wrote about almost 10 years ago about physician suicide. Physicians are amazing people, very talented to start, go and study a very hard profession, put their heart and soul into it for many years in a desire to help people. And then they come to a system that basically says, okay, if you're in the operating room, you can basically do what you want. We trust your judgment. But outside of the operating room, we don't trust your judgment at all. This question of autonomy is incredible. When you take incredibly talented people that are there to help as their main mission, and you cut their autonomy, burden them with things that we don't respect your time, we don't trust you, and we don't want you to do anything different than the standard procedure. This is just not an environment. What a day in the life of a physician would look like. Fewer people would want to go. I had one friend at Duke who came to we had dinner together on the weekend, and it was early in the evening, and he said, okay, I have to go and sleep early. Why do you have to sleep early? He said, I have to sleep early every day because I have to wake up early on the weekdays. I can't change it. So I go to sleep early every day, including on the weekends, to keep the schedule. And then he said, you don't know. He told me, he said, you don't know how lucky you are that you can go and pee whenever you want. I said, what do you mean? He was a urologist. And he said that his life is so regimented that he cannot have an unscheduled, very regulated. And I thought, what world have we come to where somebody incredibly talented has to spend some of his effort thinking about when he can go pee because the number of patients and the hours and the dedication. So I think your question is, can we accept and understand the goal of bureaucracy? I think the answer is no in the current climate of lack of trust. If there's so much lack of trust and there's so much lack of respect and so many of the rules are like that, then you basically say, I can't see good intentions. Like, how could you see good intentions? Now, do I think we can get out of this hole? Yes, I do. I'm terribly optimistic. But I think that to get out of this hole needs a real discussion and needs some real changes. You can't do business as usual with the lack of trust and autonomy and say, oh, we'll keep on not trusting you and not giving you any autonomy, but trust us that we are. No, if the bureaucratic system wants the trust of the physician, they need to take the first step. The first step need to take by the big monster, not by the little people. If we thought about it from a state perspective, you would say, if there's a reduction of trust between the government and the citizens, it's the government that needs to take the first step, not the citizens.
Especially when the power structure is such that the actionable decisions can happen in a sense much more easily from the bureaucracy to the people, or in this case, the physicians, rather than the other way around. In large part, you hear more and more arguments around physician unionization because of this lack of trust.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. And I think there's so much dead weight loss. There are two types of losses. One is I pay $1 more for coffee and you get $1 more. So I lose $1, you gain $1. Economists don't worry about that kind of. Dead weight loss is a place where everybody loses. And I'll tell you a story about something happened in Israel. So in Israel, we have a nationalized health system, but physicians don't get paid enough. And many of them have private clinics in the evening. And let's say they have to work 8 to 5, and some of them leave at 4:30. So they had the negotiation on salary, and the Ministry of Finance says, okay, we're going to increase your wage, but we want you to stamp the clock coming in, coming out, that if you leave at 4:30, you will not get paid for that half an hour. And when they were thinking about doing this, I said, don't do it. It's a mistake. Anyway, they didn't listen. They did it, and it was a mistake. Now, in what way was it a mistake? Physicians left at 3.
Correct.
Even with the pay increase, the amount they're getting from the government job is lower than private clinic by a huge margin. It was their goodwill that was keeping them at bay. It wasn't the amount of money. So yes, some of them fight a little bit. A shame, that's human nature. But the moment you say, oh, punch a clock, people say, oh, punching a clock, I get $100 an hour here, I get $500 here. I'll leave really early. And it ended up really being very negative. And the reality is that physicians, what is very hard to capture in bureaucracy is goodwill. Very hard to capture. And what physicians work on is goodwill, and they do lots of things outside of their job descriptions. Have those units that you get paid for all kinds of things.
Right.
But if you're helping a colleague, there are no units. And if you teach a students and there are no units. And this system is really trying to take something and make it into a complete contract when we can't. Want people who work for me to be dedicated. And I think that breaking task into subcomponents and giving people payments in units for different ones and not giving for others is really, maybe it's okay on average. I don't think it's correct for any individual. And I think that the moment you have this language where bureaucracy is trying to create hard rules for activities that have a huge variety. Okay, if we were going to make, I don't know, iPhones and we wanted them to be the same, I can understand payment for, whatever screw that you put in correctly. You're talking about a task like being a physician. Who could judge whether another 2 minutes you spend with somebody trying to motivate him to take their medication on time could be a good payoff? Or whether you're asking them about how their father is feeling could also tell you something about their family history. And this idea that we can think about minutes per patient, what a crazy idea to say, try and aim for this, perfectly fine. But the idea that all physicians have the same mannerism, that you take the same amount. If I'm slower in discussion and I look more and I have better discourse with people and rate higher trust, don't you think I'll have higher compliance rate if I'll take 13 minutes? It's just crazy to try and quantify things into standards that are so non-humane in the profession that is mostly around people.
So this is interesting because I've heard you talk about this before, but the scarcity mindset and this idea that in the presence of scarcity, whether that's money, time, supplies,
health problems, yeah,
whatever unit you're talking about in terms of scarcity, an extraordinarily strong motivator for lots of different behaviors that come out of it. And so I think any physician who listens to this is going to struggle and has struggled with the idea of, we recognize that there is scarcity in healthcare. There's scarcity of all of these different things. And so because we feel it largely because there's scarcity of our own time, scarcity of our own energy. And I would argue that a lot of us as physicians, and I'll speak for myself, is we try to come up with our own frameworks, our own systems of cognition and self-governance, and even our own little bureaucracies in a method, a means by which to manage that scarcity, whatever that looks like. I have to be done at this time. I have to be. So we do it to ourselves, but writ large, the system is doing that to us and nurses and medical assistants and so on. Is that scarcity mindset a large motivator for bureaucracy and for a lot of the rules that then have these unintended consequences?
So maybe we could separate two kinds of scarcity. The first kind of scarcity mindset, the best example is poverty, as you said. The nicest experiment was done in India, where people were harvesting sugarcane. And they basically tested these people's intelligence 6 weeks before the harvest, when they were poor, and during harvest, when they had some money. And they had basically a 20% difference in intelligence. Now, did they really have different intelligence? Of course not. Intelligence doesn't change that fast. But when they were under financial stress, they were constantly occupied. Will I be able to pay this bill? Will I be able to do this? Will they throw me out of my house? All kinds of thoughts like that.
Right.
And the first thing that physicians need to understand is that their patients are in a much worse cognitive capacity than they're imagining. Because part of their mind is worried. Like
Absolutely.
It's very hard not to have. So this is why you can tell people something in your office and you say, I told them that, and 5 minutes later they forget because they are in a very different cognitive. You know that I was very much attacked for people thought I helped bring about. And
Yes.
I got about a death threat a day for about 2 years. People send me videos of them burning my books. It was a very tough period. By the way, I didn't do anything else. But I felt I was in about 80% capacity. I was sitting there and working, and I felt 20% capacity just left there. And I would try to bring it, and I couldn't. It's an amazing thing. So that's one thing. Now, when people are in a scarcity mindset, it is easier to do the same thing and not to deviate? Right? When can we try to innovate? When can we try to do something different? You could say that having a procedure, a ritual, a habit, and so on really helps. As a physician, if you have all of burden to deal with and the stress, the scarcity mindset, and where it meets maybe more procedural life. But even if it's like that, I would like to present it to people and say, it's for your benefit. It's going to be tough to do this. In this book, Misbelief, when I talk about what gets people to start believing alternative things, I start with stress. And the stress is not the stress of saying, gee, I have a lot of work to do, or I have 300 emails to answer, or whatever. That's one type of stress. The stress I mean is, I don't understand the world. Then with this, right now, think about the following experiment. I show you a picture of random white and black dots. And I say, do you see a pattern? Say yes or no. I show you another one, and I show you 50 of those. What do you think happens as people get more stressed to the number of shapes they see? It goes up. Mm-hmm. Why does it go up? Imagine many years ago, we're in the jungle and we get stressed. Why do we get stressed? We think there's a tiger. What are we now trying to do? We're trying to find a tiger. Oh, these two leaves are moving. That's enough to imagine what it is. Yeah. Go into hyperdrive of trying to basically interpret the world. If I think about the people who accused me, they said, oh, this Dan guy, he worked with the Gates Foundation. He had a project on vaccines. He did something in the World Economic Forum. He has this funny half a beard. Oops.
There's the tiger.
There are two important things here. I think that the worst kind of bureaucracy is bureaucracy that looks like there's no rhyme and reason for it, right? If you think about the things that get us stressed, it's about not knowing what's coming.
Uncertainty.
Why are they doing this? Things that look arbitrary. Why are you asking for this? Where is this coming from? And those things are not just creating burden, they're also creating a sense of, I don't understand the world. I don't understand why this is happening this way. And I have many of those examples where you say to yourself, I just don't understand. Like, who is sitting on the other side? Why is that?
That is
an IRB application that sits there for 6 months and they say, we're sorry, you should have submitted it to somebody else. It's like, why did you tell me 6 months ago before we did all of these round of reviews? Who is sitting there? How are they thinking? Why are they doing this? Are they really interested in doing research? So on one hand, I think we need to understand that an explainable world is very different than an unexplainable world. And lots of stress is coming from, I don't understand what's going on here. Help me understand this. Now, when we think about patients, this is also very important, right? Because if you think about it, patients have a lot of worry about saying, why am I sick? Why did this happen to me? So they have all of these other levels of stress. And if they don't understand it, they go and try and look for other alternatives. For this book, Misbelief, I talked to many people who had very strange opinions about the world. And one of them that I talked to 3 years ago, I reconnected with her a few months ago, now has cancer, sadly. And she is refusing to take any of the standard medications. She completely lost trust in the healthcare system. She just finished 13 days of fasting. Her situation is not good, but she's refusing any treatment, right? That loss of trust. We talk physicians, but when you talk patients, I think that COVID was a lost opportunity to create increased trust between citizens and the healthcare system.
Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means you either fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please share it or like it or comment on a social media post or write us a 5-star review, something. It would really help me out. And maybe what you learned from this episode can help someone else too. The views expressed in this episode are those of the interviewer and interviewee and don't represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting make it sound like I'm talking directly to you, this is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice or financial advice or really any advice. Thanks again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.